On the final night of the 2006 summer transfer window, the Premier League witnessed one of the most baffling and dramatic twists in its history. As the clock ticked towards midnight, a club fighting merely to stay relevant in mid-table suddenly unveiled not one but two of the brightest stars in South American football. Carlos Tevez, the fiery forward who had led Boca Juniors to continental glory and conquered Brazil with Corinthians, and Javier Mascherano, the midfield general already tipped to become the best defensive midfielder of his generation, were announced as West Ham United players. The football world could not believe what it was seeing. How could two players courted by Real Madrid, Barcelona, and Europe's elite end up in East London, joining a side whose ambitions stretched little beyond survival? Fans and pundits scrambled for explanations, newspapers ran headlines of disbelief, and rivals whispered of shadowy deals behind the curtain. What seemed like a coup for West Ham would soon unravel into a scandal that exposed murky ownership structures, triggered lawsuits, and forced football's governing bodies to rewrite the rulebook. This is not just the story of two Argentine stars arriving at Upton Park. It is the story of how one shocking transfer tore open the hidden world of third-party ownership, changed careers, and shook the very foundations of the Premier League. Carlos Tevez was born in Fuerte Apache, one of Buenos Aires' toughest neighborhoods, where football was not just a game, but a way out of poverty. From an early age, he carried the scars and resilience of his surroundings, playing with unmatched hunger, forged by hardship. At Boca Juniors, he became an icon, leading the club to the Copa Libertadores and the Intercontinental Cup in 2003, scoring goals with fire in his eyes and a ferocity that endeared him to fans. By the time he moved to Corinthians in Brazil, Tevez was already a superstar in South America. He won the Brazilian League, became the heartbeat of the team, and proved he could adapt and dominate in different football cultures. His energy, his never-say-die attitude, and his ability to score in the biggest games made him irresistible to scouts across Europe. Javier Mascherano's story was different but no less remarkable. Born just months after Tevez in 1984, he came through the ranks at River Plate, where his intelligence and discipline stood out from his teenage years. Mascherano was not flashy. He was not about goals or stepovers. He was about control, about reading the game before anyone else, about breaking up attacks and giving his team balance. By 2004, he was already a key player for Argentina's national team, winning Olympic gold in Athens and earning praise as perhaps the best young holding midfielder in the world. When Corinthians signed him in 2005, they were bringing in the perfect partner to their fiery talisman, Carlos Tevez, uniting two of Argentina's brightest hopes in São Paulo. Together, Tevez and Mascherano were stars of South American football, linked with Europe's elite clubs. Real Madrid had watched Mascherano closely. Barcelona admired Tevez's relentless drive. Italian giants sniffed around, believing they would be the next step in these players' inevitable rise. And yet, in the summer of 2006, fate would twist their paths away from the bright lights of Europe's biggest stages. At the same time, West Ham United were a modest Premier League club. Under Alan Pardew, they had just come off a respectable season, finishing ninth in 2005-06 and reaching the FA Cup final, where they had heartbreakingly lost on penalties to Liverpool. Their ambitions for the following season were simple: survival. In the top flight, maybe a push into mid-table. They had solid English players, some promising youngsters, but nobody could have predicted what was about to happen. When news broke on August 31st, 2006, that Carlos Tevez and Javier Mascherano would be joining West Ham, the football world was stunned into silence. Two Argentine internationals in their prime, both courted by the world's biggest clubs, had landed at Upton Park. The announcement read like fiction. For West Ham fans, it was like waking up on Christmas morning to find two world-class stars wrapped in claret and blue. For everyone else, it raised immediate suspicion. How could this possibly be real? The day the deal was announced, the atmosphere around West Ham shifted from disbelief to celebration. Fans could not believe that two players of such pedigree had walked into Upton Park. The unveiling was dramatic, almost surreal. Tevez and Mascherano posed with the claret and blue shirts, smiling awkwardly in front of cameras, while whispers spread that something about this transfer did not add up. Still, West Ham supporters didn't care. They had stars, genuine world-class stars, and for a brief moment, the East End of London was the centre of the football universe. But the fairy tale on the pitch did not match the headlines. Mascherano, the midfield general who had anchored Argentina at the World Cup only months earlier, struggled to find his place in Alan Pardew's system. He was often left on the bench, sometimes played out of position, and rumours circulated that he was not truly under the manager's control. Tevez, too, found it difficult at first. The pace of the Premier League was unforgiving. Defenders were relentless, and he went months without scoring a goal. As West Ham's form collapsed, losing match after match, questions grew louder. Was this supposed coup actually a curse? Why were two of the best players in South America being wasted in a relegation fight? By winter, Pardew was sacked. Alan Kirbishley took over, and still the situation looked bleak. West Ham were sinking fast. Mascherano grew increasingly frustrated, and by January 2007 he was gone, signing for Liverpool on loan in a move that would eventually make him a hero at Anfield. Tevez, however, stayed, and his story at West Ham was only just beginning. As spring approached, Tevez finally found his rhythm. The fire that had made him unstoppable at Boca and Corinthians reappeared. He scored his first goal in March against Tottenham, and suddenly the goals began to flow. More than the goals, it was his energy, his relentless pressing, his refusal to give up that electrified his teammates. West Ham, once written off, began to claw their way back. The defining moment came on the final day of the season, May 13, 2007. West Ham needed something extraordinary to survive. They travelled to Old Trafford, facing newly crowned champions Manchester United, a team filled with stars like Cristiano Ronaldo, Ryan Giggs, and Paul Scholes. Few gave West Ham a chance, but on that afternoon, Carlos Tevez delivered the performance of his life. He fought for every ball, harassed United's defenders, and just before halftime, he scored the only goal of the game. West Ham won 1-0 at Old Trafford, a result that kept them in the Premier League against all odds. Tevez was carried off the pitch by delirious teammates, hailed as the saviour of the East End. But survival came at a cost. Sheffield United, who were relegated instead, immediately cried foul. They argued that West Ham had fielded an ineligible player, that the contracts tied to media sports investment meant Tevez should never have been allowed to play. The anger was palpable, the controversy unavoidable. West Ham may have survived. On the pitch, but off it, a storm was brewing that would shake the Premier League to its core. Behind the jubilation of survival lay a web of secrets that would soon unravel into one of the Premier League's darkest scandals. The arrival of Carlos Tevez and Javier Mascherano at West Ham had never been a normal transfer. Both players were not owned outright by the club, but by a company called Media Sports Investment, or MSI, fronted by the Iranian businessman Kia Jourabjian. MSI had purchased significant rights to the players during their time in Brazil, controlling not just their contracts but also the financial benefits of any future sale. When West Ham announced the double signing, they did not fully disclose the existence of these third-party agreements, a decision that would come back to haunt them. The Premier League had strict rules about transparency and ownership. Clubs were forbidden from entering into arrangements where outside parties could influence team selection or player transfers. Yet the contracts tied to Tevez and Mascherano gave MSI power over their future, effectively making West Ham the middleman rather than the true employer. For months, little was said publicly, but as Tevez's goals dragged West Ham to safety and Sheffield United dropped into the Championship, scrutiny intensified. Rivals accused West Ham of cheating, of gaining an unfair advantage by fielding a player whose contract should never have been registered in the first place. Investigations revealed damning details. West Ham had indeed withheld information about the third-party clauses from the Premier League. In April 2007, the league fined the club a record £5.5 million, citing a breach of rules B13 and U18, which govern the duty of clubs to act in good faith and the prohibition of outside influence on players. What was shocking, however, was that West Ham were not docked points. Had they been, they almost certainly would have been relegated instead of Sheffield United. The decision sparked outrage. Sheffield United claimed that justice had not been served, and they began legal proceedings to recover damages, a case that would drag on for years before ending in a multi-million-pound settlement. For Tevez and Mascherano, the contracts meant their careers were caught in the crossfire of business interests. Mascherano had already escaped to Liverpool, where the deal was restructured to comply with regulations. Tevez's situation was murkier. West Ham argued they had terminated the offending clauses in order to register him legally for the remainder of the season, but many saw it as a loophole exploited to keep him eligible. In truth, both players were pawns in a system that prioritized financial gain over sporting integrity. The scandal revealed the dangers of third-party ownership, a practice common in South America, but alien and deeply problematic in England. It showed how investors could manipulate careers, how clubs could be tempted into shady agreements to gain access to top talent, and how the rules of the game could be bent to breaking point. What had looked like a miracle escape for West Ham was in fact the product of a deeply flawed system, one that the Premier League could no longer ignore. The fallout from the Tevez and Mascherano affair went far beyond the claret and blue of West Ham. When the Premier League handed down the $5.5 million fine in April 2007, it was the heaviest financial penalty in the league's history. Yet the lack of a points deduction created an uproar. Sheffield United, relegated by a margin of just 3 points, argued that West Ham's survival had been built on the goals of a player who should not have been eligible. Their outrage sparked one of the most bitter disputes English football had ever seen. Fans protested, lawyers were summoned, and the two clubs became locked in a legal battle that dragged on for years. Eventually, West Ham agreed to pay Sheffield United a reported $21 million in compensation, a settlement that underscored just how high the stakes of this controversy had been. For the Premier League, the scandal was a wake-up call. The case exposed glaring loopholes in the rulebook and forced the league to take stronger action against third-party ownership. By 2008, FIFA moved to ban the practice worldwide, citing the risk of conflicts of interest and the erosion of the sport's integrity. What had once been a common arrangement in South America was now outlawed at the highest level. The legacy of the Tevez saga was clear. Never again could a player's career be controlled by investors whose motives had nothing to do with football. For the players, the scandal marked turning points in their careers. Mascherano left West Ham disillusioned but quickly rebuilt his reputation at Liverpool, where he became a cornerstone of Rafael Benitez's midfield. His discipline, tactical intelligence, and relentless tackling made him one of the Premier League's most respected midfielders, before he went on to achieve legendary status at Barcelona, winning multiple La Liga and Champions League titles. His time at West Ham was brief, but the lesson was lasting. He had escaped a system that nearly consumed him. Tevez's path was more complicated but ultimately triumphant. After leaving West Ham in 2007, he joined Manchester United, where he formed a deadly attacking trio with Cristiano Ronaldo and Wayne Rooney. He won back-to-back Premier League titles and the Champions League in 2008, proving himself on the grandest stage. His controversial move to Manchester City in 2009 only cemented his place in English football history, as he became the talisman of City's rise, leading them to their first league title in 44 years. To this day, West Ham fans remember him as the saviour who kept them up, even as the wider football world debates the legitimacy of that survival. The broader consequences were profound. The Tevez and Mascherano saga changed how transfers were regulated, how clubs disclosed ownership details, and how fans understood the business side of football. It revealed the murky underworld where investors, agents, and clubs intersected, reminding everyone that football is not just about what happens on the pitch. The scandal forced transparency onto the agenda, reshaped regulations, and left behind one of the most controversial legacies in Premier League history. The Tevez and Mascherano affair did not exist in isolation. Football has always been a sport where the thin line between regulation and exploitation is constantly tested. Years later, other controversies would echo the same themes of ownership, registration, and fairness. In 2017, Leicester City's signing of Adrian Silva collapsed because paperwork was submitted just 14 seconds after the deadline. The Portuguese midfielder was left in limbo, unable to play competitively for months, while Leicester fought bureaucracy. In 2013, Peter Odemwingie became the face of deadline day humiliation when he drove himself to Queen's Park Rangers in anticipation of a transfer that had never been finalized, forced to turn around in embarrassment after being denied entry. These incidents, while memorable, were more comedic than consequential. What made the Tevez case unique was the magnitude. This was not a fringe player or a small club. This was the Premier League, the world's most watched league, featuring two Argentine internationals who were among the best in their positions. The controversy didn't just cause temporary embarrassment, it decided the fate of entire clubs. West Ham stayed up. Sheffield United went down. Careers were altered. Millions of pounds were shifted, and rules were rewritten. It was a scandal with real, lasting consequences, unlike the fleeting curiosities of other transfer mishaps. The parallels extend beyond England. In South America, third-party ownership was commonplace, with investors buying stakes in young players and selling them like commodities. Clubs often relied on this financial model for survival, but the Tevez Mascherano saga showed how incompatible this system was with the Premier League's insistence on integrity and transparency. In many ways, it was a collision of two football cultures, one driven by outside investors, the other by strict regulatory frameworks. The fallout made clear which system would prevail. The lesson was simple, yet powerful. Football cannot thrive when players are treated as assets in someone else's portfolio. Tevez and Mascherano's journey to West Ham may have seemed on the surface like an improbable coup for a modest English club, but in reality, it was the symptom of a deeper problem, one that needed to be confronted and eradicated. What remains most fascinating about the Tevez and Mascherano scandal are the questions that will never have definitive answers. What if West Ham had been docked points instead of merely fined? Sheffield United would have survived. West Ham would have been relegated, and the careers of both players might have taken radically different paths. Would Carlos Tevez have ever become the saviour of Manchester City if his reputation had been tarnished by being part of a relegated side? Would Javier Mascherano have found the same path to Liverpool and later Barcelona? Or would his career have been trapped in the shadows of controversy? What if the Premier League had acted more aggressively, banning Tevez from playing altogether after uncovering the third-party agreements? West Ham's miracle escape would never have happened, and one of the most iconic goals of the decade. Tevez's strike at Old Trafford, would simply not exist. How would that have changed the mythology of English football? Perhaps United would have taken a different approach to signing him. Perhaps City's revolution would have been delayed. Perhaps Barcelona would have found a different midfield anchor than Mascherano. The chain reactions are endless. And then, there is the larger question. Did this scandal truly fix football, or did it simply push the problems into other forms? Third-party ownership was banned, yes, but today the sport is dominated by multi-club ownership groups, super agents, and private equity funds that wield enormous influence over transfers and careers. Has the game really escaped the shadow of financial manipulation, or have we just entered a new chapter of the same story? For West Ham fans, the memory remains bittersweet. Tevez is still remembered as the man who kept them up, a folk hero despite the chaos around him. For Sheffield United fans, it is a wound that never healed, a moment they believe robbed them of their rightful place in the Premier League. For neutrals, it is one of the most extraordinary sagas in modern football, a reminder of how sport and business collide in unpredictable ways. And so we leave you with the questions. Was West Ham's survival fair, or was it built on injustice? Was Tevez a hero, or a symbol of everything wrong with football finance? Did this scandal save the game from third-party ownership? Or was it simply the tip of an iceberg we are still trying to understand? Tell us what you think. Should Sheffield United have been reinstated? Was Tevez's goal at Old Trafford legitimate history, or a stolen moment? And most importantly, do you believe football today is cleaner, or are we still living under new versions of the same murky deals? Your answers will shape the debate, just as the scandal itself shaped the Premier League. This is not just history. It is a story still being written, and your perspective is part of it.